The Roman Empire did not rise on the clash of swords alone. It advanced step by step, mile after mile, on the disciplined feet of men who could march farther, faster, and with greater endurance than any rival in antiquity. Ancient writers marveled at their stamina, armies that crossed mountains in winter, rivers swollen with floods, deserts where weaker forces collapsed. Rome's real weapon was not a blade, it was the march. Consider this: if you were forced to carry nearly 40 kilograms on your back, every day, across rough terrain, could you endure? Now imagine tens of thousands doing so together, keeping time, keeping order, and still arriving ready to fight. That paradox, an empire conquered not only by combat but by movement, lies at the heart of Rome's military genius. Their legions were engineered for mobility, their endurance carefully trained, their survival ensured by systems that turned individual hardship into collective power. So how did Rome build an army that could march forever? Stay with us as we uncover the hidden mechanics of the Roman march, the reforms, the training, and the relentless discipline that transformed ordinary men into human engines of conquest. If you want the raw mechanics behind Rome's reach, subscribe to Tale of History. The march continues. Before Rome became master of the Mediterranean, its armies were built on the model of the citizen militia. Polybius, the Greek historian who chronicled Roman institutions, describes how the early republic drew its soldiers from landowning farmers. Each man served when called, bringing his own arms, and returned home at the close of campaign. This worked in the city's early wars, fought close to the Tiber or in the hills of Italy. Campaigns were seasonal, timed between planting and harvest. The men were part-time warriors, part-time farmers. The system was adequate for short struggles against neighbors. But as Rome's power expanded, this arrangement began to strain. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome faced wars in Spain, North Africa, and Greece, theaters far removed from Italian fields. Campaigns stretched over years, not months. The part-time model faltered. Citizens called from their farms were ill-suited to long overseas service. Casualties mounted. Recruitment lagged. Worse still, the armies that remained in the field were dependent on long baggage trains and an inconsistent supply system. The Republic needed soldiers who were not temporary farmers but professionals, men hardened to march, fight, and survive without the safety net of home. This crisis of manpower set the stage for one of the most important reforms in military history, the Marian reforms. In 107 BCE, Gaius Marius, a general of humble origins but immense ambition, took command during the Jugarthine War in North Africa. Facing shortages of manpower and a dysfunctional recruitment system, he did something radical. He opened enlistment to Rome's poorest citizens. Men who owned no property, who had traditionally been barred from the legions. This decision reshaped the Roman army from a militia of property holders into a standing force of professionals. But Marius went further. To sustain campaigns across vast distances, he required each soldier to carry his own kit. Gone were the long trains of slaves and pack animals that had slowed Roman movements. Instead, each man shouldered his burden. The weight was immense. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers jokingly called Marius mules. Plutarch notes that this was no insult but a grudging acknowledgement of endurance. By cutting reliance on baggage trains, Marius created armies that were faster, leaner, and less vulnerable to ambush or starvation. Soldiers became self-contained units, prepared not just to fight but to sustain themselves on campaign. This reform, harsh as it seemed, was revolutionary. It allowed Rome to wage extended wars in distant lands, where no seasonal militia could survive. The legionary became not only a fighter but a moving fortress of labor and endurance. The genius of Rome's transformation was not accidental. Every detail of the march was engineered. Soldiers were loaded like beasts of burden, yet organized so efficiently that their strength multiplied rather than broke. They marched in standardized formations, each man's place fixed in relation to his comrades. They built fortified camps every evening, turning wilderness into order. They carried hand mills to grind their own grain, shovels to dig entrenchments, and stakes to fortify their perimeter. What other armies scattered among servants and baggage, Rome concentrated into the body of the soldier himself. Polybius observed centuries earlier that discipline was Rome's defining feature. Under Marius and his successors, this discipline took on a new dimension. Soldiers became machines of movement. The endless march, through deserts, forests, rivers, and mountains, became Rome's true strategic weapon. The reforms of Marius forged a new kind of soldier, professional, burdened, yet unstoppable. But what did it mean, in practical terms, to be Marius' mule? What exactly did each legionary carry on his back, the tools, the food, the weapons, that allowed him to survive and fight far from home? When Plutarch called them Marius mules, he was not exaggerating. The legionaries' burden was staggering, between 27 and 40 kilograms, carried day after day across stone roads, mud, and mountain passes. Yet inside that weight was the secret of Rome's endurance, a complete survival system packed onto the back of every soldier. At its core was the sarcina, the soldier's load. This kit was carried on a wooden pole known as the furca, slung over the shoulder. The design was simple but effective, spreading weight across the body and leaving hands free for shield or weapon. Roman pragmatism turned the legionary into a self-sufficient marching unit. Weapons came first. Every soldier bore the gladius, the short sword famed for close combat. Alongside it were one or two pila, heavy javelins designed to shatter shields and disrupt enemy lines. Defensive weight was greater still, the scutum, a rectangular shield over 5 feet tall, often weighing more than 12 pounds. Armor added another 20 or more, the larica hamata of chain mail, the larica squamata of scales, or later the segmented plates of the larica segmentata. Archaeology reminds us that the segmentata was not universal. Mail remained common across centuries, a practical solution to Rome's vast frontiers. But the load extended far beyond weapons. Soldiers carried the means to feed themselves. Grain was issued raw, not baked, forcing men to haul hand mills to grind it into flour. With flour came bread or porridge, sometimes baked into hard biscuits for long marches. Caesar himself mentions soldiers carrying several days' worth of grain during forced advances. Alongside the grain came dried cheese, olive oil, and when luck allowed, salted meat. This portable pantry, though monotonous, meant independence. The Roman soldier was also a builder. Inside his kit was a delabra, an axe pick capable of cutting wood or digging earth. Shovels, wicker baskets, and sharpened stakes followed, the raw materials for fortifications. Josephus, the Jewish historian, described Roman troops as walking tool chests, each man equipped to raise camps or batter down obstacles. Personal gear mattered too. Cloaks for cold nights, spare caligae, the hobnailed sandals that gave traction on Roman roads, and water flasks were all standard. Archaeological discoveries at Vindolanda in Britain preserve fragments of shoes, letters, and even requests for socks, vivid reminders of the soldier's daily struggle against blisters and weather. Consider the weight: shield, sword, armor, rations, tools, personal effects. To modern eyes, it seems crushing. Yet the clever use of the furca distributed the strain, letting men keep balance on long marches. More important was the mental conditioning. The load was not an exception, it was normal life. Soldiers trained to carry it until the body accepted the burden as routine. The result was a soldier who could march days without supply wagons, who could build a camp with his own hands, and who could fight with the tools he bore on his back. Every legionary was his own kitchen, his own workshop, his own fortress. Even carrying all that, the kit was only half the secret. Training turned that burden into rhythm. A Roman soldier was not born a marcher. He was made one through relentless training that transformed the crushing weight of the kit into habit, and habit into endurance. Ancient sources describe the process in stark terms. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, emphasized that discipline was Rome's defining advantage, drilled into men until obedience became instinct. Centuries later, Vegetius, though writing in the late Empire, recorded standards that echoed older practice: 20 miles in 5 hours, fully loaded, as the measure of a competent legion. Even if Vegetius reflected a later world, his figures align with what Caesar's campaigns suggest was possible. The day began with movement. New recruits were expected to march long distances repeatedly, gradually increasing speed and load until what broke others became routine. Weighted practice weapons, double the heft of real swords and shields, forced men to build strength and stamina beyond battlefield need. Running, swimming, digging trenches, and constructing walls all formed part of the regimen. The result was not only a fighter, but a laborer, builder, and athlete, trained to switch from march to battle to construction without pause. The benchmarks are astonishing. Archaeological studies and modern military analysis confirm that an average sustained pace of around 1.3 meters per second, roughly 3 miles an hour, could be kept for hours on end. Multiply that across tens of thousands of men, each carrying 30 to 40 kilograms, and the feat becomes remarkable. The legion's daily expectation was 15 to 20 miles. Caesar, in his Commentarii, boasts of moments when his troops covered 25 miles in a single day, crossing rivers and building bridges as they advanced. The numbers only tell part of the story. Endurance was psychological as much as physical. The rhythm of the march, boots striking stone or packed earth, shields thumping against shoulders, became a steady beat that carried men forward. To fall out of line was shameful. To keep step was honor. The training instilled not just muscle but mindset. Soldiers learned to see exhaustion as ordinary, hunger as manageable, and repetition as security. The burden of the sarcina ceased to be punishment, it was identity. Blisters hardened, shoulders calloused, minds accepted the weight as constant. This was not endurance for its own sake. It was endurance designed for war. An army that could arrive after days of marching and still fight was an army with a decisive edge. Enemies expected exhaustion, stragglers, and chaos. Rome delivered cohesion, order, and sudden violence. By conditioning every man to this pace, commanders gained flexibility. A general could order forced marches to surprise opponents, confident his soldiers would not collapse. He could maneuver across difficult terrain, knowing the rear would still catch up. This reliability made Rome's legions more than military units. They were instruments of logistics, capable of sustaining campaigns that would cripple less disciplined forces. And still, the endurance of the body and the will of the soldier needed a foundation. Discipline produced stamina, but stamina alone could not explain Rome's reach. The march required a surface engineered for speed and permanence. If discipline produced stamina, it still needed a surface to run on, and Rome built that surface. When Romans said that all roads led to Rome, it was more than a proverb. It was a statement of strategy. The empire's arteries were stone and gravel, laid down not for merchants or tourists, but for soldiers. The most famous of them, the Via Appia, was begun in 312 BCE under the censor Appius Claudius Caecus. It was called the Regina Viarum, the Queen of Roads, because it set the standard for everything that followed. Technically, the road was an engineering triumph. Surveyors drove their line as straight as possible, cutting through hills and bridging valleys. A typical Roman road was built in layers, first a foundation trench filled with compacted rubble, then successive courses of gravel and sand, topped with polygonal paving stones. Drainage ditches lined each side to prevent water damage, and curbstones fixed the surface in place. The result was a road built not for decades, but for centuries. Straightness was more than pride. It shaved hours from marches. Other civilizations wound their paths with the curves of terrain, Roman roads cut across it. For an army expected to cover 15 to 20 miles daily, avoiding detours meant conserving strength. Archaeological sections of the Via Appia still show the durability of this method, stones worn smooth by centuries, yet still intact. Distances were marked with milestones, standardized measures that began at the golden milestone in the Roman Forum. From that single point, every road in the empire was measured. It was not poetry, it was control. A commander could calculate how long it would take to move a legion from Rome to the Alps, or from the Danube frontier to the Rhine. Orders, supplies, and reinforcements moved with the same predictability. The strategic logic was simple. Roads bound provinces to Rome not just politically, but militarily. Garrisons could be reinforced, uprisings suppressed, and frontiers stabilized at a pace no rival could match. Where Greeks relied on seasonal paths and Carthaginians on coastal supply, Rome planted permanent stone corridors across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. The effect was transformative. An army on the march was not slowed by mud or weather. Columns could keep steady formation across hundreds of miles. Supply wagons rolled faster, messages traveled more reliably, and the empire's reach expanded to frontiers that seemed impossible for others. But even with the best of roads, an army had to rest. And rest for Rome did not mean disorder. At the end of every march, the legions raised a fortified camp. Roads moved men, but every night the army built a small city of safety. For the Romans, the march did not end when the column halted. Every evening, the army transformed bare ground into a fortified city. These temporary encampments, castra, were as crucial to Rome's endurance as its weapons or roads. The layout was standardized. Ancient sources such as Polybius and the later writer Pseudo-Hyginus described the same formula. Surveyors selected a site and marked out a rectangle. Ditches were dug, earth piled into ramparts, and wooden stakes driven to form a palisade. Inside, the camp was divided by streets running at right angles. The commander's tent stood at the center. Legions, cohorts, and centuries occupied fixed positions, so every soldier knew exactly where to go. This uniformity was deliberate. A soldier could walk into a fresh camp and find his place without instruction. The result was efficiency and security. Within a few hours, a defensible stronghold rose from the wilderness, complete with gates, watchtowers, and ordered streets. Archaeological traces across Europe, from Spain to the Rhine frontier, show just how consistently these camps were laid out. The castra were more than military fortresses. They were instruments of psychology. The cycle never changed: march, build, eat, sleep, guard, repeat. This predictability bred resilience. Exhaustion was framed not as chaos but as ritual. Each day had the same rhythm, and routine became a shield against fatigue. The security these camps offered was also decisive. Enemies who hoped to launch surprise attacks at night found themselves facing prepared defenses. Even on hostile soil, Roman soldiers slept behind ditches and walls of their own making. Ambushes that could devastate less disciplined armies rarely succeeded against a legion cocooned inside its nightly fortress. The act of building was itself training. Soldiers labored with pick and shovel as naturally as they fought with sword and shield. Hardship was normalized, work was discipline, and the army carried within it not only the means of war but the skills of construction. Castra reveal the deeper genius of Rome's system. The empire could advance into unknown landscapes without fear of collapse. Every evening, in forests, plains, or deserts, the legions built a replica of order. For the men, it was a reminder of Rome itself: streets, walls, and authority imposed upon chaos. But camps alone could not sustain the march. Food was the fuel of endurance, and the Roman soldier carried not only weapons and tools but the raw grain to feed himself. Camps secured the night, but an army still needed bread at dawn. An army marches on its stomach, and nowhere was that more true than in Rome. The legions carried not just weapons and tools, but the grain that kept them alive. Archaeological finds and ancient texts allow us to reconstruct the diet with remarkable precision. On average, a soldier consumed between 0.8 and 1.5 kilograms of grain per day. Wheat was the staple, though in some provinces barley replaced it. This was issued raw. Soldiers ground it themselves in the hand mills that weighed down their packs, producing flour to be baked into bread or boiled into porridge. Sometimes the grain was baked into buxolatum, a hard biscuit, the Roman version of hardtack. It could last for months, if not years, and was ideal for forced marches or long sieges. Alongside grain came cheese, olive oil, and the ever-present wine or its sour derivative posca, a mixture of vinegar and water. At Vindolanda in Britain, tablets record requests for beer, bacon, and even oysters, showing that diet varied with location and availability. Salted pork and mutton appear in both texts and excavated remains, suggesting that meat, though less common, was still part of the soldier's life. What set Rome apart was not the menu but the system. Most armies in antiquity relied on foraging or the slow movement of baggage trains. Rome combined both with a backbone of horia, permanent granaries built across the empire. These vast storehouses, with raised floors and ventilated walls, preserved grain against rot and rodents. Excavations from Spain to the Danube reveal their distinctive layouts. From these depots, armies could be supplied systematically, ensuring that no single frontier collapsed for want of food. On campaign, supply became more flexible. Commanders requisitioned grain from allied cities, demanded tribute from conquered lands, or seized food from hostile territory. Caesar's commentaries describe moments when rations were carried for several days at once, especially before rapid marches. This combination of fixed depots, requisition, and portable self-sufficiency gave the legions unmatched endurance. Animals played a role, but in measured proportion. Donkeys, mules, and horses carried loads, but Rome avoided the ponderous wagon trains that crippled other armies. Wagons existed for siege engines or heavy equipment, yet daily sustenance was distributed among men and pack animals. This limited reliance on wagons reduced vulnerability to ambush and made movement across difficult terrain possible. The logistics were astonishingly precise. Columns were organized so that supplies moved in rhythm with the soldiers. Archaeological reconstructions suggest that even an army of tens of thousands could maintain order over miles of roadway, each cohort knowing its place, each animal carefully accounted for. Horia supported them from behind. Grain on the back sustained them on the march. This blend of central planning and individual burden allowed Rome to conduct campaigns far longer than its rivals. Where Greek hoplites needed to return home after weeks, and Hannibal's mercenaries demanded steady pay and resupply, Rome's soldiers could push forward for months. They carried part of their world with them, grain, mills, and oil, and Rome's infrastructure filled the rest. The psychological effect should not be overlooked. To know that food was secured, either on your back or in the depots ahead, gave confidence. Hunger broke armies as surely as swords. By removing that uncertainty, Rome turned famine from a threat into a weapon it could wield against others. Grain and shelter together created endurance. But an army stretched over miles of road still needed unity. Without coordination, it would disintegrate into chaos. With food and shelter solved, the march still required communication to hold formation. A Roman army was more than a mass of men. It was a living system, able to move in unison across miles of road, then transform into a fighting line in moments. That order was maintained through signals, standards, and discipline as unyielding as iron. The legion's voice was the blast of brass. The cornu, a great curved horn, sounded orders across the column. The tuba, a straight trumpet, called men to advance or halt. The bucina, with its harsher tone, was used for watches and camp signals. Each note carried a meaning that every soldier understood. In the dust and din of campaign, these sounds cut through confusion. Sight reinforced sound. Standards rose above the march, the aquila, the legion's eagle, the vexillum, the banner of the unit, the signa of centuries and cohorts. To lose one was dishonor beyond words. To follow one was to remain anchored amid chaos. Even in smoke or failing light, a soldier could orient himself by the glint of an eagle or the sway of a banner. The march itself was structured with mathematical precision. Columns were arranged by cohort, with measured spacing between groups. Centurions supervised relentlessly, maintaining order whether on open road or rough track. Livy describes how even in retreat, Roman units preserved formation, avoiding the panic that destroyed less disciplined armies. A force that could turn, deploy, or halt as one was far more dangerous than a mob of fighters. Discipline was not only order, it was motivation. Rome enforced loyalty with both fear and reward. The punishments were infamous. Decimation, the execution of 1 man in 10 by lot, was reserved for units guilty of disgrace. More common were floggings, extra duties, or the loss of pay. Vegetius insists that such severity was necessary to maintain cohesion. Yet Rome also knew the power of incentives. Soldiers marched with the promise of land on retirement, secured under Augustus through the aerarium militare, the military treasury. They could expect donatives, cash gifts from emperors, or plunder divided after campaigns. Tacitus notes how the legion's loyalty often swayed the fate of emperors, showing how vital these rewards were. Pride in standards, fear of disgrace, and hope for reward fused into a single system of cohesion. No rival matched this blend. Greek hoplite armies were citizen militias. They mustered for brief campaigns, often only during summer, and returned to their farms. They fought bravely in battle but rarely marched more than a dozen miles a day. Logistics were simple, short campaigns close to home. Long wars exhausted them. Carthage relied on mercenaries. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps was a miracle of leadership, but his forces depended on local foraging, uncertain pay, and fragile alliances. Mercenaries could fight with skill, but they lacked the steady loyalty that bound Roman citizens to their standards. When pay ran short, discipline dissolved. Tribal warbands, from Gaul to Germania, were fierce in combat but inconsistent in endurance. They gathered for raids or single battles, then dispersed. They had no roads, no permanent supply depots, and little patience for months of attrition. Archaeology shows few traces of long-term encampments. Their style of war was sudden, not sustained. Against them stood Rome, professional soldiers carrying their own survival, drilled into endurance, bound by discipline, motivated by pride and reward. In wars of attrition, the advantage was decisive. Rivals might win single victories, as Hannibal did at Cannae, but they struggled to maintain campaigns year after year. Rome, by contrast, wore down enemies through relentless persistence. If the mechanics surprise you, hit subscribe. We're only getting to the moments where marching decided history. When Rome's marching machine met hostile terrain, endurance turned into a strategic weapon, and one general exploited that like no other. Julius Caesar's commentaries record marches that stunned his enemies. In Gaul, legions covered up to 25 miles in a day, sometimes with rivers to cross and bridges to build before nightfall. His soldiers were expected not only to keep pace but to arrive ready for combat. This relentless mobility allowed Caesar to appear where he was least expected, striking tribes before they could unite. His wars were not just fought with swords but with the rhythm of the march. Further north, the forests of Germania tested Rome in ways no Mediterranean battlefield could. Rivers swelled without warning, weather turned harsh, and enemies vanished into trees. Yet archaeology along the Lippe River shows traces of Roman marching camps, fortifications raised quickly, used for a night or two, and abandoned as the army pressed forward. Each camp was a stepping stone of order in a hostile landscape. Germanic tribes might win clashes, but Rome's methodical advance, day after day, wore them down. On the far frontier of Britain, Hadrian's Wall embodied this same endurance. Built around 122 CE, it was not only a barrier but a supply network. Mile castles and granaries fed patrols that marched 10 to 15 miles daily in rugged weather. Endurance projected Roman power even at the edge of the known world. If you followed Rome's march this far, stay with Tale of History. The real secret of empire lies in the steps that never stopped. The pattern is clear. Rome conquered not only with tactics or superior weapons, but with engineered movement. Roads, camps, supply, and discipline turned men into machines of endurance. Each soldier bore on his back the empire's future, step after step, until provinces were subdued and frontiers secured. The cost was immense: hunger, blisters, and endless labor. But the reward was empire. Rome's greatness was not only built in marble forums or triumphant battles, but on the weary feet of legionaries who marched farther than any army before them. Rome's legacy endures not just in ruins and laws, but in the image of the soldier who carried his world on his back, and marched forever. For more untold depths of history, subscribe to Tale of History. The march of stories continues.